Hello everyone, I'm Kevin, otherwise known as 4BX257, here to bring you another 1980s G.I. Joe tour review. And today I'll be taking a look at the 1989 Cobra Battlefield robots. There's actually 4 of them, 2 Cobras and 2 G.I. Joes. But last time I had done the G.I. Joe ones, so this time I'm going to be doing the Cobra ones. Now these were all sold separately, but I'm going to be doing 2 of these vehicles in this video because not only are they related by their sub-series, the Battlefield robots, but they're actually related to one another physically. Now this one is called the Devastator, and this one is simply called the Hovercraft. No fancy name for this guy. And while neither of these made any comic book appearances, at least not in the old Marvel comic run of G.I. Joe, they did make animated appearances. They both made their first appearance in the geek animated 5-part miniseries Operation Dragonfire in Part 1. If you haven't watched my 1989 G.I. Joe Battlefield robot review, please go back and watch that first before this video, because there is some information which I might have covered in more detail in that video rather than here, because it might be a little bit repetitive if I do it here. But let's take a look at the Cobra Devastator first. Here is a not so random 3 3/4 inch figure, just to give you a sense of scale of the Devastator. Now as for the features, this thing came with 4 missiles, 2 on the front, 2 on the back here, and they are all the same design. It also had a swiveling double-barreled machine gun, which does not swivel all the way around. It actually has a stopper here, so this is the maximum amount of angle that you can get here. It does not pivot up or down, however. It does have some very large hand grips, very easy for the figure to hold on to those, and look like he's aiming the machine gun or steering the vehicle. And on the back, we have, of course, the ubiquitous antenna, which is seen on all of the Battlefield robot vehicles. Of course, this is unique to the 2 Cobra vehicles. On the bottom, we have some dumbbell wheels for the rear treads, and a little caster for the front tread. Now, as for the gimmick of this vehicle, what we have here is a steering front tread. Well, yeah, that's really just it. And here is what a figure looks like piloting the Devastator. You'll notice that the Devastator has a very hollow, very undetailed bottom, and it's so hollow that the figure's feet just kind of stick out, Fred Flintstone style. So just what vehicle did the Cobra Devastator take over from within the Cobra ground forces? Well, I could only think of the 1985 Cobra Ferret ATV, both being kind of the same speciality, I would assume, this being kind of a small off-road vehicle, and that is clearly the purpose of the Devastator as well. They also have very similar armament, this one having a dual cannon and 4 missiles, and this one, well, being the older vehicle, only has 1 large cannon and only 2 missiles. But they also have one more thing in common, and that is they both have steerable front wheels. And now for our very last Battlefield robot, the Cobra Hovercraft. Yeah, this thing got the short end of the stick when it came to being named, but it's a small one-man vehicle, and here is my not so random figure to give you a sense of scale. And as for the features of this vehicle, we have the same 4 missiles that we get on the Devastator, the same dual-barreled machine gun, which, like the Devastator, cannot rotate completely around. Not that you'd want to, because it would be right into the face of the driver there. It has the same antenna and the same dumbbell wheel and front caster that the Devastator had. As you can see, it is extremely hollow, no detail on the bottom, and is overall a very square vehicle. I mean, it looks a bit funny, but when you think that this is a hovercraft, this thing is basically just a flotation skirt around the whole thing, so being square really doesn't detract from the whole design, I don't think. Of course, this thing did have a little gimmick, despite it, like I said, being just a big square of a chassis. It did have two turnable props on the back with these large prongs so you can hold on to them and spin them. And they do spin rather freely and rather nicely. Very well detailed as well, I should think. And while the Devastator did not have a seat belt, this one comes with the standard seat belt that a lot of 1988, 1989, and some 1990 vehicles came with. And they even share the same sticker sheet. If you notice here, the sticker sheet actually does have a little Easter egg here, the DRHT. DR being the first and last letters of Devastator, and HT being the first and last letters of Hovercraft. Very interesting. And here is what the hovercraft looks like when it's manned. So just what is my choice for what the Cobra hovercraft replaced within the Cobra armories? Well, seeing as the hovercraft was actually Cobra's first hovercraft, I can really only compare it to something like this, the 1985 Flight Pod, or Cobra Trouble Bubble. Now, obviously, the Trouble Bubble actually had a flight component to it, but they are fairly similar in that this thing was a hovering vehicle, and so could this, and it both had cannons and missiles as primary armament, and so did the Flight Pod. One very interesting thing about this is that once you put a mine into the seat of the Trouble Bubble, it no longer became a manned vehicle. It was now a drone, which could be flown into objects to explode, or things would accidentally fly into it and explode. However, the designers had actually claimed that one of the reasons why they made it an unmanned drone, and I believe also the 1984 Claw, was so that you didn't have to buy a figure in order to play with this. And I believe that may have been the element of why these things were named robots, despite the fact that there's no evidence to support these things being autonomous in any way. Just like the G.I. Joe battlefield robots, there's no mention of anything robot-like in either vehicle's blueprints. Even the copy on the back of each of the boxes is vague and can't be open to interpretation. The theory that these were named robots in order for you not to have to shell out even more money in order to buy an action figure to put in there to man them is just that, it's just a theory. However, like I pointed out in the blueprints and on the back of the box, these things really don't seem to have any autonomous or robotic features, which may lead people to think that that might have been a last-minute decision to name the robots. However, it would explain their color scheme. The overall off-white, which I know turns off a lot of collectors, the fact of the matter is that the off-white gives them kind of an aircraft kind of feel, very futuristic feel to them. Kind of like the way the 1983 Cobra Snake bow armor was white. It was a very odd choice, but it was meant to give it a sort of a prototype, almost futuristic kind of a look. And that's what we have here. I think that's the choice here. Even though I suppose you could use these as Arctic vehicles, and because my Tri-Blaster is discolored, I'm using that as a desert vehicle. I actually don't mind the white bodies on the Cobra battlefield robots because along with that and the maroon components as well as the dark gray, and that's actually a very nice color scheme altogether. And it's very much within the Cobra flair for their design of vehicles anyway. And speaking of their designs, I actually like the Cobra versions much better than the G.I. Joe ones. Well, the G.I. Joe ones are, well, the Raider Rat is very utilitarian, and the Tri-Blaster is actually a very strange sports car-like thing. The utilitarian hovercraft is, well, it's very square, but I think the fans are a really nice touch. And I really like the aggressive motorcycle look of the Devastator. And here is a comparison between the 1989 Cobra battlefield robots versus the 1983 Pack Rats, the G.I. Joe robots. And as you can see, the pack rats do not have any control surfaces or seating for figures. The only way to interact figures with the robots were these individual little remote controls that the action figures could hold. A very interesting solution. In order to maintain the same type of spirit, the battlefield robots probably should have had fold-up or removable seats. But then again, like I've said before, I think making these things robots was a last-minute decision. In the early 90s, the UK and Europe release of the Devastator had no mention of being a battlefield robot on the box, but the catalog does mention it. However, I couldn't find any evidence of the hovercraft being released over there, but I could be wrong. The Devastator also had different colors. The body was light grey and the treads were blue, with the other parts being a bright red. In the early 2000s, both the Devastator and Hovercraft were released in India under the Fun School brand. They had very different colors, with the bodies being yellow, the wheels were black, and other parts were a reddish orange. If you're looking for either the Devastator, the Hovercraft, or both on the aftermarket, it's actually easier for me to recommend the Cobra versions over the G.I. Joe versions because it's been my experience that these have actually stayed intact better on the aftermarket than the G.I. Joe versions. But make no mistake, all of the maroon portions of the plastic are extremely fragile. And even if you do get them and find them intact on the aftermarket, they still aren't very popular with a collector, so the aftermarket value is quite down despite their rarity and fragility issues. But the fact of the matter is that you do have to look out for the parts and make sure that even when you do buy the parts, as an adult collector, you are still aware not to put too much pressure on those parts because they will break fairly easily. And yes, that does include very thick parts, even like the missiles. Like where you connect the missiles to the pegs, the holes seem to just branch off into little cracks. Obviously, the antenna, which is the bane of most collectors, it's not just limited to the battlefield robots. The antennas on most G.I. Joe vehicles just tend to go missing or break fairly easily. But if you're buying these things as a parts vehicle, which is a fairly easy thing to do, especially with the Cobra ones being just a bit more common than the G.I. Joe versions, you still have to look out for the peg which holds the cannons on, because those can be broken and sometimes not easily shown in photographs that sellers use. Like the twin-barreled missile. The theory that that the instruction... Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then.